Israel.
We do thank you for coming along on such a wet and cold night to hear a Bible address, and we believe we have some really important things to help you understand what's going on in the very concerning world which we all live in today. And if you've been following the news over the last week, where we've had more dramatic terrorism events, a military coup in Turkey, the situation in Britain with the Brexit vote, and our own chaotic elections, then I'm sure you are, along with me, feeling that the world is a very uncertain place at times. And we're not here to tell you that it's going to get better in the short term. Certainly in the long term, God has a very clear plan for our world to make it a much better place. But firstly, there's going to be some very dramatic events that will have to take place. And we're here tonight to talk about the power of Bible prophecy. That chapter we just read was written over 2,500 years ago. That's an awful long time. And yet it talks about the nations that are in the world today. It talks about events that are about to happen very shortly. And it's entirely relevant to where we live in history at this moment. How can it be that a prophet in Israel, writing 2,500 years ago, could be so accurate about the situation of our world in which we live? Well, it can only be because God caused these men to write. It says in the 2nd of Peter, chapter 1, verse 19, we won't go there, but it says these words, "Holy men of old spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit," that is, by the power of God. They wrote down God's words about the future. And so we have what the Bible calls prophecy. We have predictions about the future. In verse 17 of this chapter, Ezekiel 38, God actually has words recorded here that he will actually address to the Russian aggressor that tries to invade Israel. And God says this in verse 17, "Art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days 2,500 years ago that I would bring thee against them?" And you see, God already has prepared his speech for the future. And he says it's in there in the prophets. And we go to those prophets today. We're going to look at just two prophets tonight, Ezekiel and Daniel, to actually look at this particular aspect of prophecy about the invasion of Israel. And there is a future invasion of Israel, which is the subject of this chapter and of part of Daniel chapter 11. It will be an invasion that comes from the north of Israel. In verse 6, Gomer and his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters. In verse 15, "You shall come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee." So we have an invasion from the north of Israel. If you know anything about the geography of the world and you draw a line directly north from Jerusalem, you almost cut in half the city of Moscow. Directly north of Israel, in the uttermost parts of the north, as it says here, is the nation of Russia, right across the top of the world above Israel. So quite accurately, we have a prediction of an invasion from the north. An invasion that involves great armed forces. Have a look at verse 4. It says, "A great company with bucklers and shields, and all of them handling swords." Now they are the implements of the time of the prophet. We understand, of course, that the weapons that will be used in our day will be vastly different, but no less weapons of war. We're told in Daniel 11 there will be many ships. Russia has, in the last 30 years, completely revamped the power of its navy. And there's going to be a massive earthquake when God intervenes in this war. And that's we described in the latter parts of the verses. And that is what the Bible calls Armageddon. And we'll talk more about that later on. So in chapter 38 and chapter 39 of Ezekiel, we have a very clear prophecy about a future invasion of Israel. The theme is clearly an invasion. When you go through this chapter, it talks about an army being dragged by God into the Middle East. Look at verse 8. "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years." Now there's a phrase that you find that comes up a couple of times in this chapter, in the latter years. It's again in verse 16. So So this prophecy wasn't for Ezekiel's days. This was for a time long distant from Ezekiel. And the Bible says the latter days are the days that you and I live in. So here is a prophecy for today. And it's a prophecy about an invasion. Verse 16, you shall come up against my people of Israel as a cloud to cover the land, like a storm cloud coming in with great devastation. So the theme is an invasion of Israel. The aggressor, well, who's the chapter addressed to? Who is God talking to when he gives these prophecies? Well, it's there in verse 2. Set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So the power that God is talking to in this chapter is the aggressor that he calls Gog. We'll explain that in a moment. Where from? Well, from the north, as we said in verse 15, out of the north parts. The motivation. Well, the motivation is spoil. Look what it says in verse 12. To take a spoil and to take a prey. Now, the idea of taking a prey is going on the hunt for something. To turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited. Upon a people that have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land. And they are accused of coming there for spoil. That is, to take and plunder the riches of the land of Israel and other countries round about. So the motivation is spoil and control. The destination, clearly in this chapter, Israel. And when we go to Daniel 11, you'll also see there that Egypt is also one of the targets. We need to put the two records together to get the total picture of what's going to happen. So when we talk about this aggressor being Gog, why do we say that this is Russia? Well, I want you to notice verse 2 again, because here we have the power that God addresses in this chapter. We have this power defined for us. Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now let's look at those terms. What we first need to do is to actually note that in the King James Version that many of us have, there is a word, there is a name that has been translated. And that little word, the chief there, is actually a Hebrew name, Rosh. And you'll see here in these three translations, we have Moffat, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, and the Amplified Bible, that they've actually reinstated the name that is there, that has been translated, unfortunately, by the King James translators. So the Moffat says, Gog in the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh and Meshech and Tubal. Septuagint has Gog and the land of Magog, Rosh, prince of Meshech and Tubal, or Thobal. In the Amplified Bible, Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, of Meshech and Tubal. So the word chief that you have there is actually a Hebrew name, Rosh. And it should have been left as a name in the translation, as those translations correctly show it. So we have a list of names here. Gog, the land of Magog, Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. Let's look at those names and work out what we can derive from them. Now the Gog of the Bible that we find here in Ezekiel 38, the word Gog means the roof or one at the top or a dominant person, a leader. It has the sense of a dictator. In the Bible, you may be familiar with the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, there is a character there called Haman who set about to try and destroy the Jewish people by trickery over the king of Persia. And he was an Agagite. In other words, he was one of the ruling family of the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites were a Bible people who called their kings Agag, which was a very similar Hebrew word to Gog. So we have here somebody that is picking up a Bible title, picking up a Hebraism which indicates somebody who is a dominant leader who hates Israel. And that's the sense of what we get from Gog. So it's God's title for this dominant leader who organises many other nations with the intent of invading the Middle East and destroying the nation of Israel. That's what the Amalekites, the Agagites in the past always tried to do. So when we look for derivations, and bear in mind when Ezekiel wrote, he used the names of the territories that existed in the time which he wrote. So let's go back and try and work out from the historians and from those who know about these things exactly who these powers are. So we have this Gog. Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. This is what Strong's Concordance says. By Magog is probably meant the Scythians or the Tartars. Now, Scythians actually occupied Central Europe, the countries above the Black Sea. And by Rosh, the Russians. Now there's Strong's Concordance saying, when you come to the word Rosh or the name Rosh in the Bible, it's talking about the Russians, descendants of the ancient inhabitants of the river Araxes or Rosh. Let's delve into this little Rosh thing a little more. In the 1600s, a historian called Bokar wrote a book called Sacred Geography. And he said this about Rosh. Rosh is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name Russia, a nation of great celebrity in European Scythia. And again, we'll show you in a minute where Scythia was. But again, it has to do with Central and Eastern Europe. So clearly, those who have delved into the derivations of these names and the movement of ancient nations say we're talking about a nation called Russia. Another great authority on this matter is Wilhelm Gesenius. He was a lexicographer, that is somebody who's very much into the languages of the Old Testament. And he supports the position that Rosh should be translated as a proper noun. And he says that Rosh is undoubtedly the Russians. When you go to the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, it also uses Rosh as a proper noun. So all those people who've delved into these matters and the derivation of these nations clearly say that we're talking about Russia when we have this word Rosh there. Here's a more modern commentary. This is the Time magazine in 1990. And it said this about the origins of Russia. It says in 962, according to a 12th century document known as the Primary Chronicle, there occurred a semi-legendary encounter when the quarrelling Slavs sent a delegation to Scandinavia, that is to Norway, Sweden, those sort of places, to negotiate with the Vikings, whom they called Varangians, specifically with the crown, with those known as the Rus. So there was a particular branch of those from the area of Scandinavia who were known as the Rus. The Chronicle reports a Viking Rus named Rurik went to take over that region. It became known as the land of the Rus. So they were originally from the Viking tribes, and this particular band moved into Central Europe and into Eastern Europe and became known as the Russians. And you can go to Russia today and you can find this statue of Rurik. It's called the Rurik Monument, and it has under the heading on it, the Millennium of Russia. And he was from the tribe of the Rus. So you can see where the name of the Russians that we have today has come from. And all the historians agree that this title Rosh, or the Rus, was the people that came and inhabited these areas in about 1,000 years ago. So back in 1054 we have this territory that was controlled by those people known as the Rus, and it was most of Central Europe and right across, you can see over here the territory of Russia as well, and the Volga and those regions of Russia to the east. And so they were above the Black Sea. This is the Black Sea. We have Turkey down below here today and Europe across to that side. But this is the area that they originally occupied. So they are above the Black Sea. And that's the territory that we're talking about. So there's really not any doubt that we have here a description of modern Russia. The aggressor in Ezekiel 38 is called Gog, which is the dictator. The land of Magog, which is ancient Scythia, which is Central Europe. The chief prince of Rosh, which is Russia, and of Meshech and Tubal. And those are the ancient names of Moscow and Tobolsky, which was the capital of Siberia. The river Tobol is over in Siberia, which indicates the total dominion of the Russias, both the eastern part and that beyond the Urals. So we have here this description of this aggressive power in Ezekiel 38, using the ancient names but traceable down to our day to day. So we can confidently say that God was talking about Russia in our day. Now we're told here that this power, this Gog, will assemble many other nations. Look what it says in verse 4. It says, I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws. So God will actually bring them forth. God will cause these things to happen. Your army, with their horses, horsemen, even a great company. And we have in verse 5 and 6 a list of the nations who will join willingly in the confederacy with this invading power. And these are the nations. So coming from the area of Central Europe, this is where Scythia used to be, up here in this area here. The prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal comes from the north of Israel. Here's Israel here. So directly north of Israel, you go into the territory of the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. Now, ancient Scythia was, again, this area north of the Black Sea, around here. So this is without any doubt where the great invasion will be headed from. But there are many other nations that join with them in their invasion of the Middle East. We have Persia. Now, the ancient territory of Persia incorporated what we know today as Iran and Iraq. So that's very much identifiable today. Both of them Muslim nations, both haters of Israel. Iran in particular is sworn to the destruction of Israel. You can see why they would join up with this confederacy of nations. Ethiopia. Well, today Ethiopia has moved away from where it was in ancient times. We would call that territory that Ezekiel spoke about as the Sudan, which of course is also a Muslim country and opposed to Israel. Libya. Well, we know about Libya, currently in a state of chaos. But there are a number of interventions happening there which are quite interesting, in which Europe and Russia have a hand. Libya, over on the north of Africa, will be involved in this confederacy. Tagama, we can trace as modern-day Turkey. Fascinating that only this week there's been a military coup in Turkey. Who knows where Turkey's going to go in the future? Goma. Goma are the Gauls. We'll talk about them in a moment, but that also relates to France, which is even more west in Europe, and many others, and that includes all the other nations of Catholic Europe, and we could go to other places in the Bible and show you how we derive that, but let's just take it on face value for the moment. Talk about Gomer. It mentions there in verse 6, Gomer and all his bands. Now, Gomer was the name given to the Gauls, or the Galatians, who moved from Turkey and migrated west across to France. So the nations like Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, some of the parts of Western Germany, some of those parts are what we know today as the Gomerites. So they were those who moved from Turkey across to the west of Europe. Very much all Catholic nations. And again, the Catholics are very much involved in this process as we read from other parts of the Bible. So we have this confederacy of nations that's going to be put together under the control of the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. And they will come to invade the land of Israel. Look what it says in verse 8. After many days you shall be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. So there's no doubt that we're talking about the nation of Israel. I want you to notice a few things from verse 8 that were prophesied 2,500 years ago. Number one was that they would be scattered from their land and brought back. The Romans in AD 70 dispersed the Jews all over the world. Their land was taken over by other people. Remarkably, in the last century, the Jews came back into their land, established a nation, and have survived all the attempts by the Arabs to remove them. They're now regarded as perhaps the fourth or the fifth most potent military force in the world. They're a very significant factor in world affairs. They're always in the newspapers. God says that land of Israel that was laid waste for thousands of years, would come back and become a mighty nation at the time of the end, in the latter days. They're gathered out of many people. You know, the Jews claim that they have brought back their people from some 150 odd countries. And God nominated the name of the state in verse 8, the mountains of Israel. There was a lot of debate at that time, in 1948, when they gained their independence, what they would be called. Under the British Mandate, which went from the 1917 onwards, that country was called Palestine. There was a lot of debate what they would call the new nation. In 1948, when the United Nations gave them their independence. Finally, they came up with the name Israel. In fact, they used the very words, the mountains of Israel, Eretz Israel. And God had said a long time ago that that's what they would be called at the time of the end. So God was foreseeing all these events, and they would dwell safely, all of them. And the word safely there has the idea of confidently. And the Jews are very confident. Now that the Arabs are all fighting each other, the Jews are very much strengthened in their position in the Middle East. So God had it right, and that's exactly the time when he said that the invasion would come. Because in verse 9, he says to Gog, to Rosh, you shall ascend and come like a storm, as a cloud to cover that land. Thou and all thy bands and many people with thee. So all these nations are going to confederate under Russia's control, and they will come into the Middle East by way of invasion. Now notice it says in verse 11 that you will say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. The Time magazine publishes aerial photographs which you have to guess where it is. And one of the unusual photographs they put in a recent magazine was this one. Where in the world is this? Well, there's a village in Israel. Israel is known for its kibbutz system. And part of its re-establishment has been to establish these agricultural communities where the community things are all in a circle and the fields radiate out from that. And God predicted that, a land of unwalled villages. They would be known, the only nation in the world to have that system of farming. And God said, they will be having cattle and goods and dwelling in the midst of the land in verse 12. So we have this great prophecy about how the land would be organised. And then we have in verse 10 the thinking of the aggressor, the thinking of Russia as to why they would invade. Well, here's some of the things. It says in verse 10, you shall think an evil thought. So the motivations are here. Think of the value, if you were Russia trying to conquer the world or take control of the Middle East at least, one thing you would go for would be the Suez Canal. Their navy is largely concentrated in the Black Sea. To get out of the Mediterranean, you've got to go through Gibraltar, which the British control, or you've got to go out through the Suez Canal, which the Egyptians control. If you're going to make a move for a military conquest in the Middle East, you need control of the Suez Canal. So one of the things they're going to go for is the Suez Canal. Israel has developed incredible technology. So many things, so many wonderful inventions that we have in the world today come from the Jews and their brilliance in scientific affairs. Just go back some time and look how many Nobel Prize winners have been Jews. Far out of proportion to all the other nations of the world. In Jerusalem there are many holy sites that are in great dispute amongst the churches, between the Arabs and the Jews, and the Russian Orthodox Church has claims on many sites that the Jews don't agree with. There is oil in the Middle East which can be used to strangle the world's economy. If you're old enough to remember the 1970s with the oil embargoes that we had, you know what a devastation that can cause to the economy. The nation of Egypt through the 60s and the 70s borrowed heavily from the Russians to fight wars against Israel and lost them dramatically. The Russians built the Aswan Dam on the Nile, for which they never got paid. And there are many nations in the Middle East that Russia would like to curry favour with, who have one thing in common: they all hate Israel and want it destroyed. And so we can see how very likely, whether it's this Russian leader or another one, somebody with this dominant, conquering spirit will lead nations into the Middle East to take over the Holy Land of Israel. Now, you would expect there to be a protest if there was such an invasion. When we come down to verse 13, we have the protest from the Western nations and some of the Arab states. Bearing in mind, these are the ancient names of these territories: Sheba and Dedan. So the people of the Arabian Peninsula. That would include Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Dubai, and the other Gulf states, Bahrain, places like that. They have an interest in their oil not being taken over by the Russians. One thing fascinating about both the aggressor and those who protest is everybody's interested in money and commerce, goods, cattle, spoil. That's what binds their interests together. But there will be protest voices, and from outside the area we have Tarshish. It says there, the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, art you come to take a spoil? Have you gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold and cattle and goods, and to take a great spoil? So who is this power Tarshish? Who is this old lion? Well, you don't need to go very far into the symbology or heraldry of the nations to find out who the old lion is. Because you can go to Buckingham Palace, and what's right outside the gates? Enormous lions. It's been the well-known symbol of Britain for so long. When you go to look at the British flag, it's covered in lions, because that's the way the British symbolise themselves. But more than that, in past wars, the symbolism of the old lion calling up the Commonwealth countries, those who derive their origins from Britain and its empire, has been used in wartime posters. And there's a World War I poster that shows, helped by the young lions, the old lion defends his foes. Do you find it amazing that here in the Bible we have that phrase, the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof? So you have an old lion calling the young lions, trying to gather the support of the Commonwealth countries. Christadelphians have been saying for 160 years that at the time of the coming of Christ, Britain will not be wedded and welded to Europe. We've been saying that for 160 years, that at the time of the end, in the latter days, Britain will not be part of Europe. For the last 43 years, we've watched Europe try to absorb Britain into the European Economic Community. And you may be aware that in the last couple of weeks, they voted to leave, the Brexit. The situation is now becoming extremely right, where England can stand apart from the European nations that will join with Russia and protest about this invasion in the Middle East. And we've been waiting for that for a long time, and it's now happened in our lifetimes. It's happened before our eyes in the last few weeks, that Britain is now separate from that. So Britain, the old lion and the young lions will protest. And these are just a number of posters about that. A family council, there are the Commonwealth countries with the old lion in the centre. It's incredible, isn't it, how the Bible picks up this symbology that's come down through the centuries to today, because it's describing things in our times. Now I want you to come and look at Daniel chapter 11. Just keep a marker there if you can in Ezekiel. We'll come back to that in a moment, because in Daniel 11 we have a complementary prophecy that talks about exactly the same events that we've just looked at in Ezekiel 38. It gives us the conclusion of the matter, and then we'll go back to Ezekiel 38 and see how that is described in the same terms in Ezekiel 38. But we're looking at nations that we've actually identified, Tarshish being the power of Britain, France Belgium, Luxembourg, these countries which are Goma, Magog, Central Europe, Germany and the other nations here, Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, all under the control of a dominant leader called Gog. Turkey here, which we believe will be the first country to fall under this invasion, and then the Middle East below that. But when we come to Daniel chapter 11, we have a complementary prophecy that we need to understand. Now let me make some statements about Daniel 11, which might be a little hard to understand. I'm going to ask you to take some of them on face value. We don't have the time tonight to deal with them in depth. Daniel 11 is recognised by historians as one of the most incredible prophecies in the Bible because it traces the history of the ancient nations of Greece and Persia and Rome over a period of some 700-800 years. And with remarkable accuracy, it actually makes 64 individual prophecies, every one of which has come to pass with great precision. But Daniel, who was listening to this, being delivered by the angel Gabriel, became worn out with trying to take in the quantity of detail that he was getting. And so what the angel did was to just go to the end of the story. He could have gone on describing the events of the next 2,500 years to Daniel. But he chose to jump right to the end of the story and said, this is how it's going to finish, Daniel. And so we have the finish of God's plan at the end of Daniel chapter 11. If you look at verse 40, it says, and at the time of the end. Up until then, we have the history right down to the time of Christ and a bit beyond. And then he jumps right 2,000 years forward to the time of the end. The chapter is described in the terms of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And these are successive powers that occupied the territory north of Israel and south of Israel. After Greece and Persia have been mentioned at the start of the chapter, no other power is nominated by name. It's just this king, that king, north, south, north, south. And the nations that occupy those territories change as time goes by. So we come to verse 40, where Gabriel has now jumped down to the time in which we live. There is a Bible principle that I'll just put before you. A Christadelphian 160-odd years ago said this. In speaking of the events of these latter days, that is, remember Ezekiel talked about the latter days that we live in? The prophets refer not to the races of men, but to the powers on the territories. So the key to understanding Daniel 11 is to say, God doesn't tell you the name of the powers here. He just says the person in occupation of the north or south of Israel. The powers on the territories designated by the names of the peoples who anciently inhabited them. So we've got to think of what powers are around at the time of the end. Now, let me just define for you the time of the end. In the Bible, there is a set time that God has to bring his plan to fruition. God has a plan that he started right back in the Garden of Eden. He has laid out 7,000 years of history that will end in a perfected world. But there's a time of the end when God does not let man any longer rule himself. It's a time when God will take over control of the world. It's a time when the Lord Jesus Christ will come back to the earth to establish God's kingdom. Daniel 12 says, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was. That's one of the signals of the beginning of the time of the end. The world is going to go into a time of trouble such as never was. In Revelation 11 it's described this way, the nations were angry and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged. There's going to be a resurrection of all those who have followed Christ at the time of his return. That thou shouldest give reward to thy servants the prophets. God won't forget these men who wrote down his words. And in Revelation 16 we're told that that is Armageddon. Whatever you might have heard about Armageddon is probably not what the Bible says. It's not a battle in the valley of Megiddo, as most evangelical churches will tell you. It is a battle around the city of Jerusalem, where God intervenes to take control of the world. So there is a time of the end. There is a time when there will be no more opportunity to get ready for these great events. So we're talking about the kings of the north and the south. Now remember, the power that occupies the north or the south of Israel at any particular time is the king of the north or the south. Rome became the king of the north when it ruled the world from Constantinople. In 1453, the Turkish Empire took over. They became the king of the north. They oppressed Israel. They desolated the land. And we come down to verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Well, the king of the north, was Turkey. So there was a push from the king of the south. Now Britain had taken over Egypt in 1882. So there came a time when the British Empire took on the Turkish Empire. So the king of the south in Egypt, Britain, took on the king of the north, Turkey, at the time of the end. And we have the events of the Middle East. The Turks have been in control since 1453. They dominated God's land for 450 years. They occupied Israel for that time. But from 1820 onwards, the Turkish Empire began to shrink. It had gone right across to Spain, right up into Central Europe. But it began to shrink. And we find that there was a push from the south against the Turkish Empire. You may be aware of the events of the First World War, when Turkey came in on the side of Germany, and the British from Egypt advanced through Israel against Turkey. And Jerusalem was the main target of that attack. General Allenby led the British troops to take over the land of Palestine and to drive the Turks out of God's land. General Allenby decided to come into Jerusalem on foot as a mark of respect, and the Turkish surrendered the city of Jerusalem without destroying it as they had intended to do. All of that was controlled by God. What happened after that was that at the end of the First World War, the British government made the Balfour Declaration, which was a guarantee to the Jews that they would have a homeland of their own. That came out of the First World War and the gratitude of the British government to a Jewish scientist, Chaim Weizmann. So they now had the beginnings of their new nation. They could begin to regather themselves back into their land. And so they went back. Now let's read what it says in Daniel chapter 11 about the Russian invasion. So remember, the king of the north and the king of the south changes. The king of the south shall push at him. So Britain pushes against Turkey. The king of the north shall come against him, that is Turkey, like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships. So again, great amount of armour and a huge navy. Shall go into the countries, overflow and pass over. He shall come to the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. So this is talking about the same invasion that Ezekiel talked about. There we know that the king of the north, out of the north parts, will be Russia. And their first conquest will be Turkey. Now Turkey and Russia have been at odds. Remember the Turks shot down a Russian plane over Syria? That didn't go down very well. Turkey is largely a Muslim country. The Russians have a problem with some of their policies. We are looking for a time when Russia will find excuse to invade Turkey because they need the control of the Bosphorus. To get their navy out of the Black Sea, they have to go through the very narrow Bosphorus Straits, which are controlled by Turkey. Those straits are vitally important to shipping. That's why they sent the Australians there in 1915 to Gallipoli to try and take those straits. The Russians need that control, as well as the Suez Canal. So, what we see in verse 40 to 45 summarises what we had in Ezekiel, the same information. Because Turkey is a member of NATO, a lot of NATO bases are currently on Turkish soil, and the Russians hate that, and they want them removed. So they'll come from the utmost parts of the north and they will have this invasion. And let's just summarise what this says. It says there, the land of Egypt shall not escape in verse 42. So they're going to go right through Israel, down into Egypt, because there's the Suez Canal and there is the recovery of their assets in Egypt. Egypt also has oil fields. So let's just summarise what this is saying. The nations conquered will be Turkey, Israel, Egypt, Lebanon and Syria. The allies of Russia will be Iran, France, Libya, Europe, the papacy, Muslim Sudan, and some nations will actually escape this invasion. It says there, Edom, Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon, which we would say today is Jordan and Arabia. And we're told that they will actually rescue the Jews who flee eastward. The targets for Russia, well, Israel's prosperity and industry, the spoil. Egypt's wealth, the recent gas fines and the payment for the old debts, the Suez Canal, the Middle East oil and gas reserves, recently discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean. You might be aware that there have been enormous discoveries of gas and oil in the Eastern Mediterranean, which means that Russia's oil price may go down if that's exploited by somebody else, and the holy sites in Jerusalem. Plenty of reasons for Russia to get involved in invading the Middle East. Well, the final battle is described in verse 44 and 45. Tidings out of the east and the north shall trouble him. He shall therefore go forth with great fury to destroy, to make away many. So once he's got to Egypt, once Russia has got into Egypt, this king of the north has gone right through those countries and got into Egypt, he's going to hear of things happening back in Jerusalem from the northeast of Egypt. Rush back there, and there's going to be a great standoff of nations around Jerusalem, with all their armies arrayed around the city of Jerusalem. And that standoff will be the final stage for the Battle of Armageddon and God's intervention. Because it goes on to say, when he plants his palace between the seas, that is between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, around the glorious holy mountain which is in Jerusalem, he shall come to his end and none shall help him. So there's going to be a great devastation in Israel. Let's go back to Ezekiel chapter 38. I went across there just to show you this is not one isolated prophecy. God said, I have spoken in the prophets of Israel. We could have gone to Zechariah 14. We could have gone to other places to show you the same story, but it's here in the Bible. So God's battle with Gog. Well, you don't need me to interpret what God's going to do to this aggressor that comes into Israel. God says in verse 18 of Ezekiel 38, it shall come to pass when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, my fury will come up in my face. In my jealousy have I spoken. There shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. And God's going to cause an enormous earthquake, the likes of which the world has never seen, centred on the land of Israel. It will devastate the armies that have been gathered there against Jerusalem. And God says he will destroy the power of Gog in Israel. Look at chapter 39 and verse 2. Verse 1. Prophesy against Gog and say, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn you back and leave but the sixth part of thee, cause thee to come up from the north parts and bring you on the mountains of Israel. And God goes on to say that he will bury Russia, their army. 5/6 of it will be destroyed in Israel. Now, look at the annihilation here. This incredible earthquake and the destruction it will wreak. And then there will be great hailstones, fire and brimstone, volcanic activity. And God will use all of these forces of nature to destroy the armies that have come against Jerusalem and that are arrayed against his holy city. And that will be the start of God's conquest of the world. Again, if you're old enough, you'll remember this back in 1964. Khrushchev, the president of Russia, stood up in the United Nations and said, after the Cuban crisis, he said, we will bury you. Banged his shoe on the table and yelled at people to say the Russians would bury the rest of the world. Well, God doesn't say that. It shall come to pass in that day that I will give to Gog a place of graves in Israel. So God has said in his Bible, I will bury Russians in Israel. And it talks there about how they will gather the bones for 7 years to cleanse the land of the bodies that will be left after God has brought his great earthquake, fire and destruction upon them. And God will save Israel. There shall come out of Zion the Redeemer, the Deliverer, and turn away ungodliness from Jacob. God has not cast away his people, and there are so many prophecies that God intends to restore Israel as his people. So what do we see happening today? Well, we've seen Russia start its grab for territory. You have seen Russia put pressure on the Ukraine, take over the Crimean Peninsula. You've seen Russia go into Syria. You're probably not aware of the Russians going into South Ossetia. Another part over here, below the Caucasus, they've gone and invaded recently as well. They don't make the news, but Russia is consolidating its territory, and they're on the move. Russian forces, Russian army and air force and navy are now entrenched in Syria. For the first time, the Israeli air force is outgunned in the Middle East since 1967. The war in Syria has become a holy battle. The Russian Orthodox Church has got involved. They've now got naval bases in Cyprus they can use. They're supplying Iran with missiles that can destroy the cities of Israel. They're seeking conflict with Turkey. And they've been involved in secret invasions in Libya. And we look out at the world and we see terrorism. We see the fragile economy of the world. We see environmental damage. And Jesus said that the time of the end would be marked by uncertainty and fear. These are the words of the Lord Jesus Christ about the latter days. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And when those times come, said Jesus, when the time of trouble breaks out, you will know, and I will know, that all these prophecies that God has made are beginning to come to pass upon us. And it's going to be a time when people will have to make a choice, because the time will come, a time of trouble such as never was. You think of all the terrible times the world has known in years gone by, the world wars, and all the things that have happened in the past. God says this time of trouble will be such as never was since there was a nation on the earth. But it's a time of deliverance for God's people. If we have made our peace with God, if we have walked in God's ways, we can be delivered at the same time. Because the set time for God to favour Zion will have come. And that's the time his people will be delivered. Those who have accepted the truth of the Bible, who've followed in his ways, we can be saved at the return of Christ. So friends, listen to what the prophets have to say. God will do nothing, but he reveals it to his servants through the prophets. God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. Tomorrow's headlines are written here in prophets that wrote 2,500 years ago. Where to from here, friends? Well, we've had to gloss over many things. We've had to make a number of assumptions. We would love to spend time with you, perhaps in the privacy of our homes or somewhere of mutual agreement where we can sit down with our Bibles open and calmly go through all the detail of the things that we've said tonight, and to show you how you can have a part of these things. Don't put it off, friends. Everything we see happening is bringing these events to a culmination in our time. The warning is, don't get caught out by delaying. Jesus said this, watch and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass on the earth, and to stand before the Son of Man. You have that opportunity. All we can do is to ask that you give us the chance to show you what the Bible offers you by way of hope for the future. We thank you for coming, and we trust you find that of interest. Thank you.